A potential risk of participating in this study is that you may experience discomfort or embarrassment when reading the trial transcript. You can skip questions that you do not want to answer or stop participation at any time. You will be presented with a trial summary of a fictional vignette case of a dog attack that occurred in California. Trial summary. This is a case involving a dispute between Mrs. Soloway and Mr. Minette. Mrs. Soloway alleges that Mr. Minette's dog attacked and injured her dog at a local dog park. Mr. Minette alleges that Mrs. Soloway's dog instigated the attack by initially lunging aggressively at Mr. Minette's dog. Furthermore, Mr. Minette alleges that he is not responsible for the incident, nor the physical damage Mrs. Soloway and her veterinarian claim were inflicted on her dog as a result of the incident. Information about the transcript you are about to see. In a civil trial, there are two opposing attorneys. The plaintiff attorney is responsible for finding and presenting evidence that the defendant is liable and responsible for the incident that occurred and any damages. The defense attorney is responsible for finding and presenting evidence that the defendant is not liable and responsible for the incident that occurred and any damages. You will see both the defense and plaintiff's opening and closing arguments, as well as 3 witnesses for both sides. Keep an open mind throughout the entire case. Do not make up your mind about the verdict or award amount until after all evidence has been presented. Do not let bias, sympathy, prejudice, or public opinion influence your assessment of the testimony or your verdict. This project has been reviewed by the California State University Los Angeles Institutional Review Board for the Protection of Human Subjects in Research. Additional concerns and complaints or questions regarding your rights as a research participant should be directed to the Associate Vice President for Research, phone number 323-343-5000. Opening statements. These are statements and arguments made by the attorneys and are not evidence. Plaintiff's opening statement.
On April 4, 2023, at approximately 4:30 p.m., Abby Soloway brought her dog Riley to the Silver Lake Dog Park. The Silver Lake Dog Park is a completely fenced-in off-leash park where Mrs. Soloway had frequented on multiple occasions with Riley. At this day and time, Mrs. Soloway approximated there to be about 5 other dogs at the park, accompanied by their owners. Riley had never had any previous issues with another dog or human. Upon entering the park, Mrs. Soloway removed Riley's leash. Mrs. Soloway recalls Riley amicably playing with another dog named Taylor. Taylor's owner, Mr. Ramirez, and Mrs. Soloway engaged in friendly conversation as the dogs continued to play. A short while later, Mr. Minette and his girlfriend entered the dog park with his dogs, Sage and Bear. Mr. Minette removed Sage's leash while Bear remained on leash, and Sage ran towards Riley, who was now sniffing around an area distanced from the other dogs. As Sage approached Riley from behind, Mrs. Soloway alleges that Mr. Minette had not followed his dog and remained around 30 feet away with his girlfriend. Sage and Riley reciprocally sniffed each other for a few moments when, as Mrs. Soloway alleges, suddenly Sage lunged at Riley and latched onto Riley's right ear, ripping off a significant portion. At the moment of the incident, Mrs. Soloway alleges that Mr. Minette was engaged in a conversation with his girlfriend and not paying attention to his dog. Mrs. Soloway raised her voice to alert the other dog owners of the attack taking place, and only then did Mr. Minette make his way over to help separate the dogs. Riley was rushed to Mrs. Soloway's primary veterinarian at the Animal Crossing veterinary practice. There, Riley's ear was deemed inoperable, leaving Riley with barely anything left for a right ear. Mrs. Soloway alleges that Mr. Minette failed to take responsibility for the incident and acted negligently by not remaining near his dog or acting in a diligent manner to separate the dogs.
Defense's opening statement.
April 4th, 2023 was the same as any other day for Mr. Manette, his dogs, and his girlfriend, Ms. Connell. They as well had frequented the Silver Lake Dog Park on multiple occasions with no issues. Upon their arrival, Mr. Manette witnessed Sage express the usual excitement and energy of entering the park to play. Mr. Manette removed Sage's leash and noticed Sage's tail wagging happily as Sage approached Mrs. Soloway's dog, Riley. Mr. Manette's other dog, Bear, remained on leash next to the couple. Mr. Manette claims he remained an appropriate distance away as Sage explored and engaged in a conversation with his girlfriend, but kept a careful eye on Sage. Mr. Manette claims that the interaction between Sage and Riley was amicable and would not have led any owner to believe there were any underlying tones or signals of tension, aggression, or violence. He alleges that all of a sudden, Riley bared teeth and lunged at Sage, causing Sage to react. Upon witnessing this, Mr. Manette immediately ran over to intervene and remove Sage from the attack. It is only natural for a dog to protect themselves when faced with another dog displaying outward signs of aggression, such as baring their teeth and lunging. Mr. Manette made diligent observations and came to appropriate conclusions regarding Sage's demeanor and actions prior to the incident, none that would have suggested Sage engaging in violent behavior. Furthermore, Sage had never had any previous issues with another dog or human.
Plaintiff evidence. Plaintiff witness number 1, Michael Ramirez, acquaintance and dog owner. Mr. Ramirez testified that on April 4th, 2023, around 4:30 p.m., Mrs. Soloway approached Mr. Ramirez at the Silver Lake Dog Park after her dog Riley engaged in friendly play with his dog Taylor. Mr. Ramirez had seen Mrs. Soloway at the park on other occasions, and their dogs had played together before. Mr. Ramirez stated that in his experience, Riley had never displayed any signs of aggression towards his dog Taylor and overall exhibits a friendly demeanor. A few minutes after the dogs started playing, Riley went to go look around an area more removed from the other dogs, about 10 feet away from where Mr. Ramirez and Mrs. Soloway were talking. Mrs. Soloway stayed and talked with Mr. Ramirez, and he claims she kept a close eye on Riley. When Mrs. Soloway saw Mr. Manette's dog, Sage, approaching Riley, she proceeded to go up closer to Riley to observe the interaction. Mr. Ramirez claims that he has also seen Mr. Manette at the dog park with his girlfriend, Miss Connell, a handful of times. He claims that when the incident took place, Mr. Manette only came to attend to the dogs following Miss Soloway's alert to the attack. Plaintiff evidence. Plaintiff witness number 2, Marcy Wright, dog owner. Miss Wright testified that she had been to the Silver Lake Dog Park on multiple occasions with her dog Peyton and has previously met both Mrs. Soloway and Mr. Manette while being there. She testified that the separate times she met the owners, both seemed attentive to their dogs and sociable with the other dog owners. Miss Wright was not at the park on the day in question. However, she remembered an incident that took place a few weeks prior where Mr. Manette's dog Sage instigated an attack on Peyton. This incident took place on March 20th, 2023, which Miss Wright recalled because it was the day of her sister's birthday. Miss Wright recalled Sage approaching Peyton from behind, initially showing no signs of aggression. She claimed Mr. Manette was standing on the opposite side of the park speaking with a woman, later identified as Miss Connell, and did not seem to be paying full attention to Sage's actions at the time. Miss Wright alleged that in an instant, Sage lunged at Peyton, grabbing onto Peyton's neck. Miss Wright alerted Mr. Manette and the dogs were separated, with Peyton sustaining only minor tooth marks to the neck. Miss Wright claimed that although Mr. Manette appeared remorseful towards her and Peyton, the preceding interaction between the dog owners was brief and appeared hurried. Mr. Manette offered his phone number and upon doing so, took Sage and exited the park. Plaintiff evidence. Plaintiff witness number 3, Laura Abel, Mrs. Soloway's primary veterinarian at Animal Crossing Veterinary Practice. Miss Abel testified that she had been Riley's primary veterinarian for around 3 years, and Riley had always exhibited a joyful and calm demeanor. To her knowledge, Riley has never had an issue with or been aggressive towards anyone at the veterinary practice. On April 4th, 2023, at approximately 5:15 p.m., Mrs. Soloway arrived at the Animal Crossing veterinary practice with her dog Riley. Miss Abel recalls Riley being notably shaken up and bleeding from her right ear. Miss Abel stated that Riley was rushed into emergency surgery to gauge the extent of the injuries. Once in the operating room, it was clear that the damage to the right ear was irreversible. Miss Abel claimed the wound was, quote, one of the worst cases to a dog ear she has seen in her career, end quote. Defense evidence. Defense witness number 1, Sandra Connell, girlfriend of defendant. Ms. Connell testified that at approximately 4:45 p.m. on April 4th, 2023, Ms. Connell and her boyfriend, Mr. Manette, entered the Silver Lake Dog Park with Mr. Manette's dog, Sage. She and Mr. Manette have been together for a little over a year and have frequented the Silver Lake Dog Park on multiple occasions. Ms. Connell expressed great love for Sage and highlighted how Sage has rarely shown aggression towards other dogs unless other dogs show threatening signs. On the day in question, Ms. Connell shared that she and Mr. Manette hung back to converse while Sage explored the dog park. She recalled that Sage was behaving amicably towards the other dogs, tail wagging and no signs of aggression present. Ms. Connell recalled that as the couple conversed, they were made aware of the incident when Mrs. Soloway alerted them. She admits she did not see which dog instigated the attack, but testified that Mr. Manette was diligent in approaching the situation, separating the dogs, and following up with Mrs. Soloway after the incident. Defense evidence. Defense witness number 2, Dylan Choi, roommate of defendant. Mr. Choi testified that he has been living with Mr. Manette and his 2 dogs for a little over a year, and in that time he has seen Mr. Manette is a caring, attentive dog owner and has never seen him physically harm, yet alone raise his voice at either of the dogs. Mr. Choi stated that he has been to the dog park with Mr. Manette on a few occasions and claimed Mr. Manette remained attentive to Sage and the other dogs Sage was interacting with during the times he was there. Defense evidence. Defense witness number 3, Jonathan Flores, dog trainer of defendant. Mr. Flores testified that he has been hired by Mr. Manette to train Sage for about the last 6 months. Mr. Flores stated that the defendant has never missed a weekly session with Sage and that Mr. Manette has shown a dedication to shaping Sage into a well-behaved and cared-for dog. Mr. Flores stated that Sage appears to be a healthy dog, and in his professional experience, Mr. Manette has been one of the most attentive dog owners he has worked with. Closing statements. These are statements and arguments made by the attorneys and are not evidence. Plaintiff's closing statement.
Dog owners are responsible for the dog they own, hence their position as a dog owner. Mr. Manette is just as responsible for his dog as Mrs. Soloway is for hers. A fact is known. Mr. Manette's dog caused physical, irreversible damage to Mrs. Soloway's dog. Had Mr. Manette remained close to his dog and been paying attention at the time of the incident, such irreparable damage could have been prevented. Both Mrs. Soloway and her dog Riley now must attempt to psychologically repair themselves, while Riley faces an even harder feat of navigating life with only one ear. Mrs. Soloway asked for $15,000 total for economic and non-economic costs.
Defense's closing statement.
Through his dedication to dog training and multiple witness accounts of positive interactions between Mr. Manette and his dog Sage, the defendant has demonstrated levels of care and compassion that go above and beyond the regular dog owner. None of us are perfect humans, and Mr. Manette is not claiming to be one. However, we are here today to determine responsibility for a disputed action, not to judge someone's character. On the day in question when the incident took place, Sage did not display behaviors consistent with instigating aggression or violence. Any dog owner would have made the reasonable assumption that there was nothing to worry about. This is not about what would have happened if something had been different. This is about what did happen. Mrs. Soloway's dog bared its teeth and lunged at Sage, instigating Sage's actions in self-defense. Given the facts, Mr. Minette should not be found liable for this disputed case.
Now that you have seen the trial, you will be instructed on the evidence that applies to this case. Your final verdict may either find the defendant, Mr. Minette, liable or not liable. Unlike criminal cases, civil cases are proved by lower standards of proof, such as the preponderance of evidence. The preponderance of evidence refers to how it was more likely than not that something occurred in a certain way. You alone must judge the credibility or believability of the witness and attorney statements brought forward. In deciding whether a statement is true and accurate, use your common sense and experience. You may believe all, part, or none of any of the statements. It is up to you how much of the testimony you believe.